Welcome to Garden DC, the podcast about everything gardening in the Washington, D.C. and Mid-Atlantic region. I'm your host, Kathy Jentz. I'm the editor of Washington Gardener magazine, and we're aimed at gardening enthusiasts, people who grow everything from edibles to ornamentals, natives to exotics. If it grows in our area, that's what we talk about. This is episode 103 of the Garden DC podcast. In this episode, we talk with Blythe Yost, co-founder and CEO of Tilly, about weeding and mulching tips. You'll definitely want to hear her opinions about dyed mulch, rubber mulch, and volcano mulching. The plant profile is on the dwarf crested iris, and we share what's going on in the garden, as well as some upcoming local gardening events in our What's New segment. This episode, we're joined by Blythe Yost. She is the founder of Tilly, an online landscape design company servicing the USA and Canada. She's a nationally recognized landscape architect. And welcome, Blythe.
Hi, so glad to be here.
Good to have you. So tell us a little bit about Tilly and where you're based.
Definitely. Tilly is an online landscape architecture and design company, like you said. We started basically because we think everybody deserves access to good design. So our primary projects are smaller yards, people who wouldn't typically hire a landscape architect or landscape designer, and we service the entire country. So we do projects all over. I think we've done projects in 49 states and Canada. And our workforce is dispersed. So we were a COVID-friendly workforce before that was even a thing. And we don't actually have a headquarters, but we have designers all over the country.
Wow. So we'll probably get into more of that in a bit. And we're going to talk all about weeding and mulching tips and how the homeowner could use those, and also your services online in a little bit. But first, we want to talk about you, Blythe, and your background. So we always ask here on the Garden DC podcast, were you born with chlorophyll in your veins and a green thumb?
Maybe. It's a good question. I was always that kid that was outside with dirt under my fingernails. I think that was potentially more likely than chlorophyll. My mom would say it wasn't tan, it was ground in dirt. So I went to college as a plant science major, always into plants. And my first semester discovered something called landscape architecture and switched over to that pretty quickly and actually found my calling.
It's so great that you have the plant science background, because I hate to say this, but landscape architects all often have the reputation of, knowing design well, but not knowing their plants well.
I totally agree with you. And that was definitely one of the focuses of the program. I went to Cornell University. The landscape architecture program is actually part of the agriculture school, which is very different than a lot of other landscape architecture programs. And I would agree, landscape architects learn about grading and parking lots. They don't necessarily learn about what plants go where. So I would concur. Sometimes gardeners are way more plant knowledgeable than landscape architects. But plants are really my first love. I like them more than parking lots.
And what's your own home garden like?
All the things that were left over from someone else's. Um, there are inevitably things that either don't make it, somebody doesn't like, leftovers. So my job is to try to squish them all and make them all into something lovely. So it's a constant work in progress, I suppose, is the best way to answer it.
And where are you based out of?
I am in New York, just kind of north and west of the city, suburbia,
Mm-hmm.
but it lends itself well to smaller garden spaces, and we would be zone. Gosh, it's so funny. I can't even tell you what zone anymore because it's changing so rapidly. But we're probably 6B.
And so, with the online landscape design that Tilly is doing, are most of your clients, you said you had clients in 49 states, and you probably want to get that 50th so you can claim that. I'm going to guess that's Hawaii or Alaska.
No, it's neither one. I feel like it's Nebraska or one of the Dakotas.
Ah, that makes
And
sense.
I don't recall which one. No, we've actually done a couple in Hawaii,
Hmm.
some really fun projects. And we definitely have one Alaska. We were super proud to put that feather on our caps.
And so, can you describe the process a little for somebody who might come to the website and want a landscape design done? Are they just getting the design and implementing it all themselves afterwards?
Yes. So our process is purely design at this time. So if somebody did want to do their project, they would come to Tilly. We offer a front, back, or full opportunity. So you don't have to design the whole yard if you don't want to. And we offer up to 2 acres. Anything larger than that is tricky for us to do from a remote standpoint. So you would come in. We ask you for a bunch of information. We ask you for photos of your site. We ask you for a site survey if you have one, and then we'll pair you with a designer who has native plant knowledge in your region. That was something we discovered was really important right away. I don't know anything about California or Texas. I'm a New York East Coast designer, and it's really important to make sure the plants are correct for the region. So we'd pair you with that designer. You do a video call with them, and then they jump into design, and we turn around designs in about 2 weeks.
That's pretty quick, I would say 2 weeks.
The design process is usually there's about a week on the front end, kind of gathering all your information and setting up that call. But it's important for us to be able to get good design to people quickly.
And then once they have that design, they would have like a list of materials or plants that they would purchase.
They have a list of plants and a list of materials, and we just started offering plant delivery services across the country as well. So it turns out actually purchasing your plants is a pretty big pain point for a lot of people. People aren't comfortable with substitutions or comfortable with, is this, if I can't quite find that, can I put this in? Or, how do I know that it's a healthy plant? So we launched plant delivery services about 4 months ago and have had great success. It's been super fun, super interesting, and we've partnered with a ton of great nurseries across the country delivering plants, and we're working to make that more of our kind of core service. You get your plan and then also your plants from Tilly.
I would very surprised that that is the pain process because that's the most fun of the process to me is plant shopping.
Says the plant
Yeah,
person, but not all of our people are plant people.
that's so funny. But yeah, maybe a plant personal shopper is needed, or just people are, as you said, not comfortable if that, particular salvia is not in stock, picking another salvia.
Totally. And even, our plant lists are all appropriate for the region, but that doesn't mean your local nursery is going to carry them. We had one client in Florida who rented a U-Haul and drove all over the state trying to pick up all their plants. Just not because the plants we specified were wrong, but because the nurseries only tend to carry what's looking great, what's in stock, what's available, what sells, and that's not always what's the best for your landscape.
Yeah, I would say that they had quite a task.
Yeah, right?
But and then it sounds also like they wanted an instant garden, which often isn't going to be the case, it's all about the
Sure.
process, and I guess they wanted everything at once planted at the same time, so that's gonna be hard for a lot of people.
Definitely.
So then once they have it installed, that brings us to the maintenance side of things that we're talking about today with you, which is the weeding and the mulching. So maybe we'll start off our talk on the mulching side of things because it's a time of year when you're cleaning up your garden, getting it ready for entertaining, and if other people's gardens are anything like mine's, all of a sudden in the last 2 weeks the weeds have leapt up. They've doubled and tripled in size. So let's talk about maybe mulching materials and maybe define a few things for us to get started. So what do you generally use when you mulch your garden?
I tend to use a natural bark chip mulch. I only use natural mulches. I don't like any of the dyed products. I don't think that they are great for the soils. I've read and learned they're often, pressure treated lumber that's been ground up and then dyed. So I tend to only use natural bark chip. Or, I mean, I love a leaf mold if I can get it or make it myself. So the more natural, the more organic, the more kind of the closer to compost, in my opinion, the better it is. There is a material that's pretty localized up here called sweet peat. I don't know if you've ever run into it,
Mm-mm.
but it is a composted wood shavings from like horse stables, and it's beautiful stuff if you can find it. I think NutraPeat is another one, and it's a much kind of finer texture than the bark chip, but it kind of does the same thing. It's just really pretty if you can find
Mm-hmm.
it.
That sounds fabulous. Yeah, I'd love to have trial that. But so you mentioned leaf mold. So for our listeners, we should probably define that a little more because some people use alternative terms for that. So sometimes they'll say shredded leaves or partially composted leaves. And as you said, leaf mold. I'm trying to think of the other words I hear people use for that.
Yeah, that's a much nicer word than leaf mold. I suppose
Mm-hmm.
that sounds like kind of grody. Um, but yes, shredded leaves. And I think you can actually purchase leaf shredders. I have always just kind of bagged leaves in black plastic, and then you kind of set them aside in a kind of a forgotten spot under a deck or something for a season or two. And they kind of partially decompose, like you're saying, and form that nice kind of rich humusy material that still inhibits weeds, because then the leaves layer on top of each other, and kind of give you that a more significant barrier than using just a traditional compost or something like that. Some municipalities that collect leaves will sell you or give you leaf mold, or composted leaves. So it's sometimes worth checking with your local DPW or highway department.
Yeah, here in the Mid Atlantic, we have something called Leaf Grow, GRO, like all one
Ooh,
word. And that comes from the composted leaves and yard trimmings that are picked up and then brought to a central facility in Montgomery County and Prince George's County. And I was just looking at their bag and they call it soil conditioner, which I didn't even
interesting.
think about that they are putting the biggest words on the bag are soil conditioner and 100% organic. And then when you look them up under what category they are at a, like a hardware store or something, it says leaf compost. So that's, I think, the best word for it is, partially composted. You still can recognize pieces of the leaves, but they're not the whole or, just been shredded leaves.
Sure. And I think the challenge there is trying to differentiate that from a more compost that you would use as an amendment.
Hmm.
Trying to define what's a mulch and what's an amendment. And I would agree with you. It's definitely a gray area. It's sort of like what your soils need, right? If an amendment, a compost or a leaf mold or any of that is going to be less weed inhibiting
Hmm.
than a bark chip or something that's a little bit of a bigger grain.
Hmm.
So anyway, but if your
Yeah,
soil needs it, it's such a good thing.
exactly. And I would say that it's also a spectrum of how quickly those materials are going to break down and add into the soil. So, like with our heavy clay soils, that is one of the best things is leaf grow or that
Hmm.
that soil conditioner, what we're calling it at that point. But I do use it as a top dressing, and I will mix it in with planting holes when I'm planting something. So it won't be 100% leaf grow in the hole. I'm going to put some native
Yeah,
soil in there, but it's going to be a good handful of it at least with it. So that does bring up using compost, straight compost as a mulch. Do you ever do that?
I do. Not significantly, and certainly not on a commercial basis. Not certainly not like even on other residential projects. Um, Mostly sort of in my own garden because I know I'm prepared that it's not going to really hold the weeds back. I don't think it's not going to do much for that, but it's going to do great things for your soils. I think compost is the best thing we can be adding to our soils. I'd rather see people using that than any sort of fertilizers. At least reach for the compost first. I think you're totally spot on using it in all of your new plantings, new planting beds. I think there's a lot to be said about using a mixture of your native soils and compost. rather than bringing in a bunch of kind of topsoil, which seems to be something that those landscape architects like to specify all the time. But turning compost into native soils, you're inevitably going to create a deeper rooting media for your plants. So although I wouldn't potentially reach for it as my first mulch solution, I think it certainly has a place in that space. And I mean, if you're not going to have the time to turn it into all your beds, then put it on top, and you'll get some of the properties, even if it's not perfect.
Yeah, I would say I'm definitely the type of gardener. I'm going to call myself a lazy gardener or a too busy gardener, that I'm not going to be working it into the soil, but I'm going to let the soil microorganisms come up and do that for me.
Totally.
And they're going to do all the work, and it's going to disappear. So that's one other factor I guess we can talk about in mulching materials, is the hardship you were talking about is going to last probably most of the growing season, right? But a really fine composted leaf compost or leaf mold, that might disappear by June or July and need a second application, or and then maybe even a third at the end of the summer.
Yeah, and I think that's where education comes in, because I definitely have people who are like, oh, and I have to mulch my yard every year. And I'm just like, well, yes, it's the best thing you can possibly do for your garden. And they're like, well, when I buy that red dyed stuff, it stays around for 4 years. And the point is like, maybe you don't want it to. So something that doesn't break down, it's not going to be as good for your plants. So maybe, us lazy gardeners, I'm totally in your camp. It's a balance, doing good things for your soil, but also keeping the weeds down and keeping the beds looking clean.
Yeah, and I mean, if I always tell people, if it disappears, that's a good thing. It didn't go away with the wind. It worked its way into that, hard pan clay soil, if that's what you have, or if you have sandy soil, or whatever else that's it's helping to
Sure.
amend it. So let's talk a little bit more about some materials for mulching with that we love or hate, or don't even care about. It could be neutral about. So you mentioned the dyed mulches, which are, yeah, not a favorite of mine either. And I have to bring up the rubber mulches that are being sold now, and ask what you're thinking of on those.
Ugh. Again, like, do you want a whole bunch of rubber and ground up tires all in your soils? They are not going to do anything good for your soil, in my opinion. They do stay around for a long time, so maybe the longevity piece is a plus if we're trying to find silver linings. But I don't feel like putting plastic or rubber ground up on your soils is a good move. Some people will use it under playgrounds, and I don't even love it there. I don't really want my kids playing in a bunch of ground up tires. But there are poured rubberized surfaces that can be nice under playgrounds, that stay put and don't move around, because that's the other problem. I mean, it just gets everywhere. So I don't think that rubberized mulches, and along the same lines, gravel mulches are very interesting.
Hmm.
I think in sort of the Mid-Atlantic Northeast region, they're a little bit tricky, just to keep clean and keep looking nice. Out west, you see a lot more of them, and down in Florida. But in the right place, a gravel mulch can be the right answer. You're just going to probably need a weed barrier underneath, because it's not going to totally do the job.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. I like the look of a gravel mulch in some areas, and especially if you can have a level area, or like a herb garden or a rock
Mm-hmm.
garden, that's always nice. But you need that weed barrier cloth underneath, and then after a couple years, dust, soil, birds poop out seeds. You're
Mm-hmm.
going to have to weed that, but it is a more permanent mulch. And I've seen those like white marble chips that people will use around foundation plantings, and I'm like, well, it looks great now and maybe
Yeah.
next year, but don't think that that's not going to need, pulling up and weeding in a couple years.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I just from a design standpoint, I would err on the side of a native stone, as we say. Whatever your native stone, which is going to be less expensive if you're going to do a gravel, just because it'll be easier to find, and if it's not going to be as vibrant as the
Mm-hmm.
the marble chip. I feel like that's all you'll see in that yard. And then once it gets like a little bit of algae, it'd be like the green marble. So potentially not the best solution for longevity.
Yeah, unless you're doing like a Mediterranean themed garden.
Sure, there's always an exception.
Maybe there's use for that there. I was also thinking of when you were saying the pea gravel is, those are great for the pathways in between. So
Hmm.
if you don't want to do turf grass pathways, you can definitely lay down some, weed cloth and do a nice pea gravel. And it's always fun to have that crunch and that texture. And, there'll be a little maintenance, but not as much as it would be around plantings and beds. I've also seen in our area, and especially in Chesapeake Bay, ground up oyster shells and other
Ooh.
materials that I've been trying to source. So I'm always like, what can you reuse to be in the pathways where you wouldn't have to weed as much and hold down that? So, of course, wood chip bark is great, but some of those other materials that we can think of that we could reuse. And so another one I was thinking about was pine fines
Hmm.
and also chopped straw. And that's more for using in the planting beds, not in a pathway, though.
Now, do you guys use pine needles in your region, or are you a little too far north for that?
We're kind of on the edge, so it's being used more and more. I will see in local gardens in the Mid Atlantic, and we had just done in Washington Gardener magazine a story on a Pennsylvania seller who's starting to sell pine fines in kind of like a bale that you pick up from
Hmm.
them. So you don't get it delivered, you have to arrange and do a pickup, and then you get this tight bale, and they're long pine fines. So they're like that long pine
Hmm.
needle. I guess it's
I
over
think it's
almost,
yellow pine that they
yeah,
use.
it's a longish one. So it's definitely a different look, and it sticks around longer. It doesn't break
It
down as
does.
quickly, but it's really pretty. I see it a lot in North Carolina gardens.
And I think they do it really well. I worked for a company that used it in New Jersey, and it looked very strange. And I felt like it didn't do a great job holding down the weeds, but it would stay around forever. So you'd have all these pine needles, and then you'd have all the weeds. But I think further south, they sort of know how to do it. And I think it sort of almost like mats itself together. So it becomes pretty impenetrable. In
Hmm.
just observations. I think it's fascinating. I don't know that much about it, but that's super interesting. You're seeing it creep northward.
Yeah, I'm trying it out just around my a couple roses. So
Cool.
I just want to try it as different textures. And I've chopped the pine fines a little bit smaller and finer, so they do create that matte, but then it doesn't look like, a big fluff, you know,
Yeah, yeah. It was
sitting
super
on top of the soil.
fluffy.
Yeah, and I think that's where, if it's a denser planting, you're not going to see that. Well, that does bring up another type of mulching or manure or compost in between plants, which is a green planting. So using other plants to be that understory and that weed blocking by maybe a ground cover plant or layering of plants.
And I think for the lazy gardener, or what you had another term that I thought was much nicer than lazy, the busy
The
gardener,
busy gardener.
which certainly defines my life. That is usually my default. I like to plant kind of end to end, make sure that all the spaces are filled. I love creeping perennials and things that will kind of come up at different times. That way, even if you do have a few weeds, you just don't notice them because you have so many other wonderful plants coming up through. Kind of those full dense beds tend to be my preference rather than sort of uh, shrub space, or even perennial space, perennial. And it does require, more plants up front. But as we dig and divide, move things around, your plant spread, your garden ages, I do think that that's sort of always my goal, always my dream, that I don't need as much mulch. I mulch the fringes, I mulch the back sections, but the middle is sort of taken up by the plants.
Yeah, I have a friend who works in public gardens who has a huge pet peeve about seeing mulch. Like he always says, you should not see the mulch
I love it. That
around it.
exactly. I
Yeah.
totally like your friend.
So, but there's definitely the American aesthetic that you described where it's, a bed of full of mulch, and then maybe 3 shrubs all isolated by themselves, not touching, and then some isolated perennials in front of them. So I think that's just what people are used to seeing, say in commercial
Mm-hmm.
um, places like, your local shopping center or something. So that's what they imitate at home. Whereas really what we want to see is plants touching, intermingling, and overlapping, which is a little bit harder maintenance wise, but in the end, less work.
Totally agree. How do we tell them all about that?
Maybe just as examples and just showing them. So the more we can, you know, model that type of garden and make that the norm, the more people will use it. But I think there's a lot of people selling a lot of bags of mulch in the springtime. So
It's true. I would agree with you.
we might be battling a whole industry there. And of course, it's easier to just do the one and done, like you said earlier. Like my one spring mulching, you know,
Yeah.
just your hands off, and then that's it for the season. I'm not going back out there except for to mow. And then it looks nice and neat. So that's a way to control. So it does bring up one thing about mulch is it is a weed barrier. So when we're talking about ways to fight weeds, the more permanent and thicker it is, the better. But what do you advise for thickness for, say, the wood chips that you're applying?
Well, we have to talk about mulch volcanoes, right? Do you guys know what? Do you know what I mean? Where there's
Mm-hmm.
a tree, and then somebody has just mounded up mulch after mulch after mulch around the tree,
Mm,
and it just you have inches and inches, and it's sort of strangling the tree. So I would never have more than 2 inches if you can avoid it. Potentially, if it's someplace where you're not anticipating any plants ever growing, but the mulch will not only inhibit the weed growth, it will also prevent some plants from spreading, like little vincas and little ground covers need to be able to creep onto a little bit of soil to grow. So 2 inches is sort of my 2 to 3 inches, maybe four in like a back spot, but always want to keep mulch away from tree stems and even your plant stems. You don't want to be building it up against anything. The other piece is like make sure it stays away from your foundation. You don't want to have a big buildup of mulch along your siding. It'll rot your house or along your air conditioning unit. So building much mulch up against things is never good, plants um, or structures.
yeah, that's great advice, especially to pull it back, along those edges of your foundation and from the tree trunks. It should be, close to, maybe within a couple inches, but not actually touching, which reminds me of, I think it's called arterial fungus. That could be in your hard wood mulch. And, if that's up against the house, you'll get this like, looks like a spray of a shotgun of mold across your siding, and people are always like
Yikes.
did somebody throw mud against my house or something? But that comes from this mold that kind of like explodes in the hardwood bark. And it's always interesting to see that, and the less you can have it close to your house the better, because it also introduces, of course, termites.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. All sorts of things. So
Hmm.
mulch is great in its space, but you don't want too much of it. Too much of it can be a problem.
Yep. Yeah, and let those tree roots breathe a little bit. They don't, they don't need to be suffocated with a huge layer of that. So that brings us to other ways we can combat weeds. So we talked about doing that nice layer of mulch where plants aren't growing. So if there's any bare soil that you're not planting in, what else can we do to combat weeds?
I mean, not everybody doesn't want to hear it, but the best way to combat the weeds is pull them out before they flower, ideally, and pull them out fully and completely. So that's part of having a trowel or one of those fancy little forked spades is useful too. And pulling, when the soils are looser, so after rain is more useful too. I really, that's the only thing I feel like I'm good at advocating. I don't really feel great about landscape fabrics that would be like a weed barrier, just kind of put across the bed. Again, it sort of strangles the soils and prevents those other plants that we're trying to get to intermingle and grow together, prevents them from doing that. And also the pre-emergence, like a preen. I think that's a kind of pre-emergent. But the things that you would broadcast in the spring that kill weed seeds, actually they prevent germination, but that's beside the point. But those again will help. They'll damage your soils, and they do make life easier. And it's a balance. So maybe there are beds that need to be either you need a landscape fabric so you can focus your time on other beds, depending on how large your yard is. But I really think tried and true, pull the weeds out. Have a 5-gallon bucket, do a few at a time, try to get to them before they flower. To me, that's the best answer.
Yeah, I would say early and often is probably the best.
There you go.
And
I love it.
then there's always the ones that sneak in that you miss the first time because they blended in so well. Or the vines that sneak in like under a shrub and up through it. And
Sure.
then you're like, ugh, so I have to get under there and get that one. What are your personal weed enemies? Like maybe give
Oh,
a top three
I
for,
have a thistle. Just this is
oh,
my own personal. Like I don't know where it comes from. I've gone at it so many times, and it was up. I swear it was up like 3 months ago. I was like, "Where are you? How are you here? Nothing else is even green, and there's the thistle just kind of popping up." And I think it's moderately rhizonomous, so it sends lateral roots, so it just pops up everywhere, and you can't pull it out without gardening gloves. So even it has to be like a production. You have to prepare to go out and get the thistle. So that's certainly my own issue. But I guess it's more about the invasives. So when you start getting barberries that creep in, or knotweeds, like those really noxious rhizonomous weeds that you pull them, you think you get them all, and then just bloop, you left a tiny piece and it shoots up and it's brand new. It's like you were never there. Those are the weeds that make me crazy. There's also the good weeds that you pull out and you're just like, it comes out easily and cleanly, and you're like, I did it, and you make a huge improvement by pulling one weed. I feel like garlic mustard is one of those, when you just pull it out and it's just like, gone. So they all have their own hierarchy, and I'm sure every gardener kind of has their own cross to bear, and then the ones that they're like, I got those are a piece of cake.
yeah, there's something satisfying about getting that, like the whole weed, root and all,
Totally.
or like pulling a vine along the ground that just comes up like a zipper. You're like zip, 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 zip. And that was like such a monster that was coming through the bed, and you're like, ooh, that was easier than I thought when I
Yeah.
when I got that. So that's always satisfying feeling. How do you actually feel about weeding, Blythe? I never asked you that. Like at the beginning of our conversation, I should have said, is it something you enjoy doing? Is it a Zen meditation, or is it something you dread?
Oh, it's a good question. I definitely don't dread it at all. Any excuse to get out into the garden. I think the challenge is finding the time for me. I'm definitely that busy gardener, running a business, having kids, all the things. But in my perfect world, if I had all the time, I would go out and weed all day. I mean, it's a great way to kind of get in the dirt. Um, Weeding allows you to kind of be with your garden and spend time thinking about your garden. Definitely is a level of meditation. Even if you're just meditating on like what to do next, like, oh, I didn't know I had this hole here. Like, what can I plant? What can I move? I think it's a great time to kind of think through your spaces a little bit.
Very true. And how do you feel about reseeding plants that you planted? So, on the spectrum of letting things kind of go a little bit more wild and letting plants return maybe in other spots that you didn't originally plant them in versus keeping things very in check.
I have told many a client, when you see like a little foxglove popping up, or a little alchemilla, or whatever it is, that's the harbinger of a good garden. When your plants that you planted start becoming your weeds, you're doing something right, in my opinion. I think that's what we should all strive for. So volunteers are definitely my favorites, but I think there's something to be said about it. Any plant that's growing in the wrong place should be considered a weed. It doesn't matter if it's a tree or a tiny little clover. If it's not where you want it and it's your garden, then you should feel fine pulling it out, in my opinion. That said, have a little flexibility. Just because you didn't want it there, it wanted to be there. So give it a minute, think about it, and if it's growing and it's happy, like, see what happens.
Yeah, and if it's a weed peony, send it my way.
Ooh, I want one of those. Yes.
Now, I always tell people that, when you're cleaning up around the garden and something's not in the right place, and you don't want it, pot it up and bring it to a plant swap or give it to a newbie gardener or somebody else because they're definitely going to want it.
Absolutely. And I think like digging and dividing is super important. So, populating your garden that way. But that's not what we're talking about today. But that's,
Mm-hmm.
I think sort of in the same vein as volunteers,
Mm-hmm.
moving things around. I feel like that's kind of in the same vein as weeding, moving things around your garden. Things don't always have to stay put.
So, are you the type of gardener who comes home from the garden center with a bunch of plants that you didn't intend to buy when you went to the garden center that day, and then you have to figure out where to plant them, or do you always go with a plan in mind?
It's a good question. Only because I don't go as a landscape architect who but I feel like I don't end up going to the garden center. I end up with somebody's cast off plants and then I have to find homes for them. So I think it's probably maybe the former, the person who all the plants you didn't intend to buy, except I really didn't intend to buy them. They weren't even, they were for somebody else's house and they landed in my yard. So now I get to use them up, which is a fun challenge for me. I love that. I love trying to figure out how to work all these stragglers and find homes for everyone. But I certainly don't have in my own garden. I don't have a plan. I have a plan for everybody else's garden, but my own is kind of a work in progress. But it has structure and order, and I do have some things that I know I need to get. But that's more the structural plants. So I like to build a garden around a few structural plants, maybe a few hedges, some evergreens, a few things that have rhythm and order, and then let the rest of it be a little bit haphazard or wild. That way you have a backbone, but you still have a little room to play.
And how are you with weeds that just will not quit? So those are the ones that noxious weeds that keep coming back. Are you okay with using a chemical like Roundup, or do you just keep on top of cutting it back, cutting it back, cutting it back, every time it pops back up?
It depends on where it is. I've been battling some Japanese knotweed for a long time, and that, despite all my research, really the only way to really get at it is with some Roundup. If if I've done that, and when I do that, it's a spot treatment, so it's painted on. You cut the stem and you paint it on, so it's not a broadcast. There are definitely some really bad invasives out there that I'm prepared to bring out the big guns. But for the most part, I would never go rounding up my thistle. I'll just complain about it and keep working at it until it goes away. Um, so it depends on the weed. But thistle is just annoying, whereas Roundup, knotweed is a really nasty, nasty plant.
That's one of the ones I had definitely in mind when I asked the question because I do have readers asking about that. Also, mulberry tree seedlings, like in cracks that are just
Yeah.
not stopping. Like you can cut them all the way back, but that once that root gets established in that crack, it's just not quitting on them.
Yeah, yeah, and sometimes if it's got to go, it's got to go, or else you're gonna have to pull up the whole sidewalk or side of the house or whatever it is.
And I think our last question about weeding I want to ask you is about in containers. So do you have any tips for that?
That's interesting. Weeding in containers. So, I find the squirrels will bury things in particularly my front containers, and I get
Mm-hmm.
suddenly a little, ooh, baby oak tree.
Yep.
So, it's generally pretty easy to pull things out, because your soils are loose. But I don't, I always want to pull all the things out. I don't want the root competition, in my containers because it is limited space. So if I'm planting my containers, I want the things that I want in to flourish. So I would definitely keep after the weeds. It just, you have to pull them out. I wouldn't put some sort of barrier down, or even a mulch. I don't think it's really worth it. I think a container is a space that you want every square inch of soil to be filled by sort of by design, even if you are that gardener that likes, bush space, bush.
Yeah, and I definitely can relate to the squirrelscaping that happens in containers and moving things around and, adding those little baby trees that all of a sudden come up the next year and you're like, "What is that
What?
coming out of that that container?" So any last thoughts on mulching and weeding tips?
Um, you mentioned mulch bags, and I think just how the mulch is getting delivered is kind of interesting. I will say I think bags are probably the easiest for the average gardener, just because they're easier to move around. However, it's going to be so much cheaper if you just get some mulch delivered. You get like a yard delivered, and do walk it around with your wheelbarrow. So I think thinking about how it's going to be delivered, then there's less waste. You don't have to throw out all those bags, which I kind of love. Often, what was it? Often and
Oh,
what was your
early,
little
I
your
think
little
it was
adage? Early and often.
early and
Yes,
often. Yes.
I think that's brilliant. I love a good plant adage. They're some of my favorites. The one I tell people all the time is like the growth cycle. The first year they sleep, and then they
Hmm.
creep, and then they leap. So early and often on the weeding, I think that should be the takeaway.
Yeah, and I love what you said about the plastic bags that come with a lot of mulch orders. Because bulk is a lot easier if you can handle it. I know some people that's the only way they can get it is bagged to bring around, say, to a backyard where a delivery just isn't going to happen because there's no alley access or anything else like that. But I do know a lot of people who are giving that issue thought these days of how we can cut down on those plastic bags, if there's a way to have reusable bags at some point or some other type of unique solution. So hopefully, in the market, we'll see something come up in the next few years.
Yeah, I love that. That would be great. Reusable mulch bags. I've seen them for soils,
Hmm.
but I haven't seen it for mulch.
Yeah, I don't see why, if you could do it for soil, that you couldn't do that for a mulch as well. So
Totally.
that's something to keep in mind. And you had mentioned getting the weeds before the flower head forms. And it's not because we don't like what weed flowers look like. Some could be pretty, right?
Yes, totally.
It's because we want to grab them before they go to seed. And then I wanted to give a little warning out to listeners. So once you pull a weed that has the flower head and it starts to go to seed, that should be evacuated from your property, like not added to your compost pile.
Yes. Otherwise, you'll have lots of little babies all
Mhm.
over.
Yeah, because most of us just don't have a big enough compost pile to get enough heat to kill the weed seeds. That's just not going to be possible at a home garden.
Yes, I think that's great advice. Weed seeds are, and those are the ones that get in all the little cracks, and then you have a zillion more things to pull up.
Yeah, and it does also bring up quality of what you bring into your garden. So you referred to some of the deliveries you can get, and we talked about some of the nicer grades of mulch and compost out there. So free is great. And I'm all for free, but sometimes free comes with a catch, right? That they haven't heated it up enough or they haven't sifted it enough. So it's going to come with some debris materials that you're going to have to sift out, or it might come with some weed seeds in it. So that can happen a lot, with a municipal pile where they're just straight chipping a tree, and that might bring maybe some poison ivy in with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point. There's nothing more disheartening than spreading a bunch of mulch and realizing that you actually added to your weed burden. So I think that's a very very good cautionary tale.
Yeah, I think most experienced gardeners have had that happen at least once or twice while they've been gardening, is that they added something in. Maybe they got, soil from somebody or a site that they didn't know, or maybe they brought some straw in that had a chemical on it. So definitely beware and ask questions for your sourcing.
I think that's great advice.
Blythe, so where can our listeners get in contact with you for more information about Tilly and yourself?
You can go to the Tilly website is tillydesign.com. So it's Tilly. You can schedule a call with our customer service department if you have any questions about the Tilly services, or just kind of browse through them there. We're available on social media, Facebook, Instagram, all the things. I think we're just recently on TikTok. Very exciting. And then if you want to get in touch with me directly, you're welcome to email me. It's just blythe@tillydesign.com. I'm happy to chat or get you in the direction you might need to go if Tilly would be a good answer for your garden.
Great. Thank you so much, Blythe.
Thanks so much for having me. This was super fun.
Dwarf Crested Iris Plant Profile. The dwarf crested iris, Iris cristata, is a small iris that is native to the eastern United States. This dwarf iris is beardless, and it faces right up at you, unlike so many other woodland and native flowers that require you to peer at them from a snail's vantage point. It grows just a few inches tall and is best suited for the borders of woodland paths and fronts of part-shade flower beds. When not in flower, the narrow foliage is like that of bearded iris, but as it is much smaller, it is hardly noticeable. The bloom time is late April to early May. It blooms on the previous year's growth, so it will take a year to establish and flower after planting. It spreads slowly by underground rhizomes. It's easy to divide and share or put in different spots around your own garden. If you want to propagate it by seed, allow the seed pods to dry on the plant, then break them open over an envelope to collect the seeds. They are drought tolerant, trouble-free, and require no care once established. It does well in rock gardens and on slopes as well. Iris cristata, you can grow that. What's new in the garden? Well, it's been a soggy week, but the flowers love the rain and it's making weeding easier. In local gardening events, I wanted to draw your attention to a fun one hosted by Common Good City Farm, and that is on V Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., right near Howard University and Hospital, and it's called a Salad Slam. This sounds like a lot of fun. It's Friday, May 13th from 6 to 8 p.m., and you can register in advance for that and get your tickets. There's going to be free food, kids' activities, farm tours, and a book signing with Janice Evans, author of Recollections About Race, Getting to the Roots and Healing. Other upcoming local events are Saturday, May 14th at Green Spring Gardens, their Big Spring Plant Sale. Look for the Washington Gardener magazine booth there, and that is free to attend. You can find out more about that at fairfaxcounty.gov under their Parks tab. And a quick reminder that my co-author Terry Spate and I will be at Brookside Gardens on Monday, May 16th as part of the Silver Spring Garden Club meeting. Terry will be giving a talk on her other book, Black Flora, Profiles of Inspiring Black Flower Farmers and Florists, and we will be signing our book, The Urban Garden, before and after that talk, and of course she'll be also signing copies of Black Flora. Both books you can purchase from the Brookside Gardens gift shop, or bring your copies of the books and we're happy to sign them there as well. You can find out more about that at silverspringgardenclub.com. Happy gardening! If you're a crafty gardener like myself, I want to introduce you to Let's Make Art. I do a lot of DIY projects in the garden, from painting my garden gloves, to creating kokedama, to pouring my own stepping stones. And there's a company that can make it easier for you. Let's Make Art is a revolutionary crafting company that aims to help everyone to channel their inner artist, whether they're 3 or 63. With the assortment of products and subscription offers, there's an endless opportunity fun, and access to easy-to-understand tutorials and resources for everyone to learn a craft or take up a hobby. Anyone can have art supplies delivered right to their door in the form of monthly subscriptions, project kits, and supplies for a variety of activities. You can start learning basic lettering techniques to get more familiar with your abilities with hand lettering for that garden journal you might be keeping. You can also shop all the best lettering supplies, boxes, and kits curated and approved by in-house artists. There's free weekly art journaling tutorials by art journaling artists and instructors. Everyone can join with their supplies at home. Grab the prepackaged kits or get all the videos first with an art journal box subscription. Learn from watercolor artists and instructors. Whether you're a total beginner or you've mastered the arts, Let's Make Art takes the guesswork out of watercolor and creates easy and fun kits. The only thing you'll need is a brush. Let's make art simple, together. Check out Let's Make Art today by going to our special link, zen.ai/GardenDC. That's zen.ai/GardenDC. Happy crafting!
In the new book, The Urban Garden by Kathy Jentz and Terry Spite, you'll find dozens of inspiring and creative ways to grow flowers, shrubs, vegetables, herbs, and other plants in small spaces and with a limited budget. Whether you want to grow on a balcony, rooftop, front stoop, or a tiny urban patio, turn your growing dreams into reality and build a gorgeous and unique garden that showcases your personal style while still being functional and productive. With the ingenious ideas and resourceful tactics found here, you'll be maximizing yields and beauty from every square inch of your space, while also making a lush outdoor living area you'll crave spending time in. The Urban Garden, 101 Ways to Grow Food and Beauty in the City, comes out this spring. You can pre-order it now at Amazon.com and bookshop.org.
Thank you for listening to Garden DC. You can become a listener supporter for as little as 99 cents a month by going to anchor.fm/GardenDC/support. Another way to support this podcast is to subscribe to our monthly digital publication, Washington Gardener Magazine. To do so, go to WashingtonGardener.com. Thank you. You can find Washington Gardener online at WashingtonGardener.com, on Twitter at WDC Gardener, on Instagram at WDC Gardener, and on Facebook.com at Washington Gardener Magazine.